The town of Harrow sits at the edge of the Kuskokwim River, about 40 miles upstream from where it empties into the Bering Sea. I need to describe it carefully because the place itself matters to what happened. Harrow is not remote the way people outside Alaska imagine remote. There's a post office, a fuel depot, a school that serves 11 villages by correspondence, a clinic staffed by rotating physicians who fly in from Bethel on 2-week contracts. The Alaska State Troopers maintain a shared office there with fish and game. There is a gravel airstrip long enough for twin otters, and in good weather, a Hercules supply plane once a month from Anchorage. Around 400 people live in Harrow year-round. Yupik families mostly. Some white residents who married in or washed up decades ago and stayed. A few federal employees. The town has generators, satellite phones, a VHF repeater tower, and in winter, a road of packed ice that connects it to 2 neighboring villages until breakup in May. The point is this: Harrow is not the wilderness. It sits next to it. The wilderness begins at the eastern tree line, about 1.5 miles past the school, where the boreal spruce thins into open tundra and the land climbs gradually toward the Kilbuck Mountains. But in town, there are people. There is infrastructure. There are witnesses. That matters. I arrived in Harrow on September 14th, 2009, on a Monday afternoon Cessna from Bethel. I was 46 years old and had been with the Fish and Wildlife Service for 22 years. The assignment was a 12-month posting as the resident enforcement officer for the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge's Eastern Management Unit, roughly 1,800 square miles of tundra, river drainage, and low mountain terrain stretching from Harrow East to the Kilbuck Crest. My duties were standard for a sole officer station: wildlife enforcement, subsistence compliance monitoring, habitat surveys, coordination with village public safety officers, and general federal presence in a region that rarely saw any. If you're the kind of person who keeps coming back to hear these stories, I appreciate that. You might consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. I don't tell them often, and I don't repeat them. The posting had been vacant for 14 months before I took it. That fact was in the file, but nobody discussed it directly during my briefing in Anchorage. My supervisor, a regional coordinator named Phil Trask, mentioned the vacancy only in logistical terms. The cabin would need restocking, the snow machine might need servicing. The radio equipment hadn't been tested since the last officer left. He did not explain why the last officer left. When I asked, he said the man had requested reassignment for personal reasons, and that it had been granted. The name in the file was Dale Riggins. I'd never met him, but I knew people who had. Good officer. 11 years in Alaska. Not the kind of person who quit a posting without cause. I asked Trask whether Riggins would be willing to talk to me before I went in. Trask said he'd retired. I asked when. Trask said about 6 months after leaving Harrow. That was the end of that conversation. I want to be precise about my state of mind arriving in Harrow because it becomes relevant later. I was not nervous. I was not apprehensive. I had wintered alone in Alaska before twice at stations further north, once in the Brooks Range and once on the Seward Peninsula. I understood darkness, cold, isolation, equipment dependence, the psychological weight of long winters. I had managed all of it competently. I was fit. I was experienced. I had no history of depression, anxiety, or any psychiatric condition. My marriage had ended 4 years earlier, amicably, and I had no dependents. I say this because when people hear what happened in Harrow, the first explanation they reach for is that I was fragile or lonely or predisposed to seeing things that weren't there. I wasn't. I was one of the most stable officers in the region, and that is precisely why they gave me the posting. The The cabin sat at the northern edge of town, about 200 yards past the last occupied house. It was a federal structure, green-painted plywood over a log frame, metal roof, single story, 3 rooms. An equipment shed stood behind it with space for the snow machine, fuel drums, and survey gear. A VHF antenna rose from a concrete pad beside the shed. The cabin had electric heat run off a diesel generator, a backup wood stove, running water from a holding tank that was filled weekly by a town utility truck, and a satellite phone cradle mounted to the kitchen wall. Comfortable by field standards, ordinary by Harrow standards. I spent the first 3 weeks establishing routine. Introduced myself to the village public safety officer, a Yupik man named Thomas Alexei, who had held the position for 9 years. Familiarized myself with a subsistence calendar. Mapped my patrol routes for the fall caribou season. Checked the snow machine a Ski-Doo Skandik, heavy duty, well-maintained despite the vacancy. Filed my initial station report. Made myself visible in town, which is the single most important thing a sole enforcement officer can do in a small community. Visibility builds trust, and trust is the only authority that functions when you are the only federal officer within 100 miles. Thomas Alexei was helpful, efficient, and friendly in the way that Yupik elders often are generous with practical information, reserved about personal opinion. He walked me through the seasonal patterns, when the caribou moved through, where the moose calved in spring, which families ran trap lines, and which stretches of the river saw the heaviest salmon traffic, where the snow drifted worst in January. He was thorough. He was professional. But there was one exchange during those early weeks that stayed with me. We were standing outside the clinic on a clear afternoon, late September. The tundra was already turning deep russet and gold, spreading east toward the mountains, the birch along the river drainage going yellow. I mentioned that I planned to run a series of solo patrols into the eastern tundra during October to get a baseline survey of caribou movement before the snow settled. Thomas looked east for a long time. Then he said, "You should take somebody with you." I told him I appreciated the concern, but solo patrols were standard for a single officer station. I had the satellite phone and the VHF. I'd file route plans. He said, "That's not what I mean." I waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not unfriendly, not worried exactly, but assessing, like he was trying to decide how much to say. Eventually, he just said, "The Eastern country has its own rules. Some of them aren't in your manual." I took it as a cultural statement. Indigenous communities throughout Alaska maintain relationships with the land that are different from the federal framework. I'd encountered this many times. It was never adversarial. It was simply a parallel understanding that existed alongside mine. I respected it, I made a note of it, and I moved on. October arrived. The days shortened noticeably. By mid-month, we had about 10 hours of functional daylight. The temperature dropped into the 20s during the day and single digits at night. No snow yet, which was unusual. The tundra was dry and brittle, the kind of hard frozen ground that holds tracks well and makes travel straightforward. I ran my first solo patrol on October 8th. 12 miles east on the snow machine, which worked fine on frozen ground, following a drainage that fed into the Kisaralik River system. Standard wildlife survey. I carried binoculars, a GPS unit, a camera, my sidearm, a survival kit, and a thermos of coffee. I was out for 7 hours. I documented a small group of caribou, 14 animals, cows and calves, moving south along the drainage. I saw ptarmigan. I saw fox tracks. I saw the remnants of a wolf kill, probably a week old, mostly scattered bone and hide. Normal October activity. I ran 3 more patrols over the following 2 weeks, varying my route each time. The country east of Harrow is vast, an open low tundra rolling gradually upward toward the Kilbuck foothills, broken by shallow drainages and occasional stands of dwarf willow. Visibility extends for miles in every direction. You can see weather coming from 50 miles out. It is not a landscape that conceals anything, or so I believed. On October 23rd, during my 4th patrol, I found the first thing I couldn't explain. I was about 9 miles east-northeast of town, following a caribou trail along a slight ridgeline. The terrain here was higher than the surrounding tundra by maybe 40 feet, just enough elevation to give a broad view in every direction. I'd stopped the snow machine to glass a distant tree line to the south when I noticed something on the ground about 20 yards ahead. Footprints, human footprints. They were clear and distinct in the frozen ground, pressed deep enough that whoever made them had been walking with weight a heavy pack maybe. The prints were large. I estimated a men's size 11 or 12 boot. They followed the ridgeline in the same direction I'd been traveling east and extended as far as I could see in both directions along the ridge. This was unusual but not alarming. Subsistence hunters travel the eastern tundra regularly. Trappers use these ridgelines. A man walking a trap line with a loaded pack would leave exactly this kind of print. The only odd thing was the timing. Trapping season hadn't opened yet, and caribou hunters in this area almost exclusively used snow machines, or ATVs. Walking 9 miles into open tundra with a heavy pack in late October was possible but inefficient. I followed the prints east for about a quarter mile, taking photographs every 100 yards. The stride was consistent, roughly 30 inches, no variation. The person had been walking at a steady pace. No stops, no course changes, no deviation for terrain. The prints followed the ridgeline with mechanical precision, never wandering even a foot to either side. That bothered me slightly. Not the direction ridgelines or natural travel corridors, but the consistency. In my experience, people walking cross-country adjust constantly. They step around tussocks. They shift their line to check a view. They stop to rest or look at something. These prints showed none of that. The stride never changed, the line never deviated. I followed them for another quarter mile before they ended. They didn't turn, they didn't fade, they stopped. One final print, the right foot, pressed deep and clean into the frozen ground, and then nothing. Undisturbed tundra ahead for as far as I could see. No scuff marks, no sign of a pack being set down, no indication that the person had stepped onto rock or harder ground that wouldn't take an impression. The soil composition was identical on both sides of the final print. I stood there for a while, looking at it. The rational explanations were limited. A helicopter pickup was possible, but I would have heard a helicopter anywhere within 30 miles, and I'd heard nothing all day. The person could have backtracked in their own prints, but the prints showed no doubling, no overlapping toe impressions, no smearing that comes from placing a foot into an existing track. Each print was singular and clean. I photographed the terminus extensively. I recorded the GPS coordinates. I checked the surrounding area in a widening spiral for any additional sign tracks, disturbed ground, equipment marks, anything. There was nothing. Just the ridge line, the final footprint, an open tundra in every direction. I went back to town and mentioned the tracks to Thomas Alexei the next morning. I described the location, the direction, the stride pattern, the way they ended. I asked if he knew of anyone running a trap line or hunting in that area. Thomas listened carefully. When I finished, he asked me one question. Which direction were they going? I said east, toward the Killbucks. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nobody from here walks east this time of year." I asked why not. He said, "We just don't." That was the extent of his explanation. He didn't seem frightened. He didn't seem evasive. He simply delivered the statement as fact. The way you might tell someone that nobody swims in a particular lake because it's too cold. A practical boundary. Not a superstition, a practice. I filed the track observation in my patrol report and moved on. November came in hard. The first real snow arrived on November 3rd, 8 inches overnight, followed by another 6 over the next 2 days. The temperature dropped below zero and stayed there. Daylight compressed to about 6 hours, and even that was more of a prolonged twilight than real day. The landscape transformed. The open tundra became a featureless white plain, and the mountains disappeared behind a gray ceiling that wouldn't lift until spring. My duties shifted. Snow machine patrols became shorter and more weather-dependent. I focused on river corridor monitoring, checking fish camps that should have been vacant, and responding to occasional calls from Thomas about subsistence violations, minor stuff, mostly timing infractions. The work was routine. The isolation was manageable. I maintained a schedule. I ate regular meals. I kept the cabin organized. I read. I ran the generator on a disciplined fuel rotation. I was, by every professional and personal measure, performing well. On November 19th, I received a satellite phone call from Phil Trask in Anchorage. It was a routine check-in. How were supplies? Did I need anything on the next cargo flight? Were there any enforcement issues? Standard. But near the end of the call, Trask mentioned that he'd heard from the Bethel office that a researcher from the University of Alaska Fairbanks was planning to winter in the Harrow area. A wildlife biologist named Dr. Maren Caldwell, studying caribou migration disruption in the Killbuck foothills. She'd been awarded a federal research permit and would be operating out of a field camp about 14 miles east of town. Trask asked me to coordinate with her on logistics and safety check-in on her periodically, make sure she had emergency communication, the usual researcher support duties. I said that was fine. Trask paused, then said, "She specifically requested the Eastern Unit. Turned down a study site near Bethel that would have been a lot easier, just so you know." I didn't know what to do with that information at the time. I filed it. Dr. Caldwell arrived in Harrow on November 28th. She flew in on a chartered bush plane loaded with equipment camera traps, data loggers, solar battery packs, a heavy-duty tent system rated for Arctic conditions, and enough freeze-dried food for 3 months. She was 34 years old, compact and deliberate in her movements, with short dark hair and the kind of direct eye contact that communicated she had already assessed you before you started talking. Her handshake was firm. Her questions were specific. We met at the airstrip. I helped her organize equipment onto a cargo sled. She told me her research focused on a specific herd segment, about 200 caribou that historically wintered in the Killbuck foothills that had shown anomalous movement patterns for the previous 3 years. The animals weren't following established migration corridors. They were fragmenting into smaller groups and moving in patterns that didn't correlate with food availability, predator pressure, or any environmental variable her models could identify. "Something is displacing them," she said, "but nothing in the data explains what." I asked if she had a working hypothesis. "Several," she said. "None of them are very good." I liked her immediately, not because she was charming, she wasn't trying to be, but because she was honest about the limits of her own knowledge. That's a quality I've always trusted in the field. I helped her establish her camp over the next 2 days. She chose a site in a shallow drainage about 14 miles east of town, sheltered from the prevailing wind by a low cut bank, close to a frozen creek that would provide water when melted. The setup was professional. Double-walled Arctic tent, proper wind anchoring, a cooking shelter separated from the sleeping area by 20 yards per bear country protocol, even though grizzlies were denned by November. Battery bank connected to folding solar panels that would catch whatever thin light was available. 2 satellite phones, 1 primary, 1 backup. A VHF radio tuned to my frequency. As we worked, I mentioned the footprints I'd found in October. I described them clinically: location, stride, termination point. I asked if she'd reviewed any reports of other researchers or survey teams operating in the area recently. She hadn't. But she listened carefully, and when I described the prints ending abruptly, she looked up from the equipment case she was organizing. Ending how? I described it again. 1 final print. Right foot. Clean impression. Nothing beyond. She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "I've read the displacement data for the caribou going back 5 years. The anomalous movement starts every year in mid-October and ends in late March. Right when the ground freezes solid enough to hold good prints, and right when it thaws enough to stop holding them." She let that sit for a moment, then went back to unpacking. I didn't ask her what she was implying. She wasn't implying anything. She was noting a correlation. That's what scientists do. But the correlation unsettled me in a way I didn't fully understand, because it suggested that whatever was disrupting the caribou operated on the same seasonal schedule as whatever had left those prints, and that both might be responding to the same condition. I left her camp that afternoon with a check-in schedule established. I would contact her by VHF every morning at 8 and every evening at 6. If she missed 2 consecutive check-ins, I would come out. If she activated her emergency beacon, I would come out immediately. She agreed to these terms without resistance, which told me she was experienced enough to respect the protocol rather than resent it. December arrived. In western Alaska at that latitude, December is not simply winter. It is the deepest expression of winter, a condition that operates on you physically, psychologically, and temporally. The sun rises around 11 in the morning and sets by 3:30 in the afternoon, but the light it produces is so flat and low that it barely qualifies as daytime. The rest is darkness. Not twilight, not dusk, darkness. The kind that starts at 4 p.m. and lasts until 10:30 the next morning. 18 and a half hours of night, every day. The cold settled into a baseline of -15 to -25 Fahrenheit. Wind chill frequently pushed it past -40. The snow was dry and granular, driven into hard drifts by a constant northeast wind that came down off the killbucks like something with intention. On still nights, which were rare, the silence was so complete that I could hear my own blood moving. I maintained my routine. Morning radio check with Marin, patrol or station work during daylight hours, evening radio check, dinner, reading, generator maintenance, sleep. The morning checks with Marin were professional and brief. She reported her observations, I confirmed weather forecasts. She was deploying camera traps along the caribou corridors and checking them on a rotating schedule, snowshoeing out to her stations and downloading data every 3 days. Her initial findings were consistent with the anomaly she'd described. The caribou were there, but they were behaving strangely. Small groups moving at odd hours. Cows without calves in areas where calves should have been present. Animals standing motionless for extended periods in locations that offered no forage and no shelter. "They're not grazing," she told me on December 9th. Some of these groups just stand in the open, facing east, for hours. I asked if they could be listening for predators. Caribou don't stand in the open to listen for predators. They move to cover. These animals are doing the opposite. They're exposing themselves. On December 12th at 6:14 p.m., Marin called me on the satellite phone instead of the VHF. Her voice was controlled but faster than usual. "Ashcroft, I need to describe something to you, and I need you to just listen before you respond." I said, "Go ahead." "I went out to check camera station 4 this afternoon. It's about 2 miles northeast of camp, on a bench overlooking the drainage. I got there around 1:30, right when the light was best. The camera was still mounted, still powered. But the data card was gone. I started to ask if the housing had been damaged by an animal. The housing was closed," she said. "Latched. The camera was functioning. The card had been removed by someone who opened the housing, pulled the card, and closed it again. The latch takes 2 hands and a deliberate motion. No animal does that." I asked if the tracks around the station showed anything. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That's why I'm calling you on the satellite phone instead of the radio." I waited. "There are no tracks, Ashcroft. None. The snow around the station is undisturbed. I snowshoed in, and my tracks are the only ones within 200 yards in any direction. There is 14 inches of settled snow around that camera, and nothing has walked through it except me." I sat in my cabin and listened to the wind outside and said nothing for several seconds. Then I asked her to check the camera's internal log, which records every time the housing is opened, independent of the data card. I heard her tapping the unit. Then she read me the log entry. The housing had been opened at 3:47 a.m. that morning. At 3:47 a.m. in December in western Alaska, it is minus 20 degrees, pitch dark, and 14 miles from the nearest human structure. And someone or something had walked to that camera through 14 inches of snow, opened a latched housing designed to resist animal tampering, removed only the data card, closed the housing, and left without disturbing a single inch of the surrounding snowpack. I told Marin I was coming out first thing in the morning. She agreed, but before she hung up, she said one more thing. The camera at Station 4 was pointed east, toward the killbucks. Whatever was on that card, whatever it recorded, that's what someone didn't want us to see. I set the satellite phone in its cradle. I looked at the wall of my cabin, at the map I'd pinned there during my first week. I found the location of camera station 4. It sat on the same ridgeline where I'd found those footprints in October. The same ridgeline, the exact same elevation contour. And those footprints had been walking east. I left Harrow at first light on December 13th, which meant I left at 11:15 in the morning. The sky was a deep steel gray, the kind that offers no horizon, just a uniform compression of cloud and tundra merging into each other at a distance you can't reliably judge. Temperature was minus 19. Wind out of the northeast at maybe 10 miles per hour, enough to push dry snow across the surface in low ribbons that looked like something breathing across the ground. The snow machine ran well. I followed the drainage east, the same route I'd helped Marin establish when she set up camp. 14 miles in open country on a Scandic takes roughly 45 minutes if you're not pushing it, and I wasn't. I carried my standard patrol kit plus a forensic evidence bag, a second GPS unit, and a headlamp with fresh batteries. I also carried the camera trap's user manual, which I'd pulled from the station's reference shelf that morning. I wanted to understand exactly how the housing latch mechanism worked before I got to the site. The manual was clear. The housing used a spring-loaded compression latch with a thumb release on each side. 2 latches, one on top and one on the bottom, both requiring simultaneous depression to open the case. This was a deliberate design. It prevented ravens, foxes, wolverines, and bears from accessing the electronics. In 15 years of camera trap deployment across 4 states, I had never seen an animal defeat that kind of closure. I reached Marin's camp at noon. She was already packed and waiting, snowshoes lashed to her pack, a second camera trap slung over one shoulder. She looked tired but focused. We exchanged brief greetings, and she handed me a thermos of coffee without my asking. We drank in silence for a minute, standing outside her tent, looking east toward the ridgeline where Station 4 was positioned. "I went through my other stations this morning," she said. "All 5 of them. Cards intact, housings latched, no disturbance. Only Station 4. What was Station 4 pointed at? A bench above the drainage where I'd been documenting a group of 7 caribou that bed down there every 3rd or 4th night. They stand facing the Killbuck foothills, and they don't move. I wanted time-lapse footage of the behavior. How long had the camera been deployed at that location? 9 days. And the card would have held 9 days of footage? Continuous motion-activated capture. 30-second video clips triggered by infrared detection. At the activity levels I'd been seeing, the card would have been maybe 60% full. So there was something on it. She looked at me. There was definitely something on it. We left camp at 12:30 and moved northeast on snowshoes. Marin set the pace. She was efficient and practiced, reading the terrain well, choosing her path to minimize exertion. The snow was firm enough to support us without sinking more than a few inches. The light was already fading, that peculiar Arctic winter light that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, casting no shadows and flattening all depth. We had maybe 2 hours of functional visibility remaining. Neither of us spoke much during the walk. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been speculation, and we both understood that speculation before examining evidence is a way of contaminating your own observations. I focused on the terrain, on the snow surface, on any mark or irregularity in the white expanse around us. There was nothing. The land was clean and undisturbed in every direction. We reached Station 4 at 1:45. The camera was mounted on an aluminum pole driven into the frozen ground, positioned at the edge of a slight bench that overlooked the drainage to the south. The housing was a weatherproof hard case, dark green, about the size of a shoebox. From 20 yards away, everything looked normal. The pole was upright, the housing was closed, the solar trickle charger was still connected. Marin stopped me at 15 yards. "I want you to see the snow first." I looked. She was right. The snow around the camera station was pristine. Her snowshoe tracks from yesterday approached from the southwest, clear, distinct, identifiable. They went to the camera, circled it tightly, and returned along the same path. No other tracks of any kind. No depressions, no disturbance, not even wind scour that might have obscured earlier tracks, because the pole and housing would have created enough of a wind shadow to preserve any impressions nearby. If anything had approached that camera from any direction, the snow should have recorded it. I walked a full perimeter at 15 yards, studying the surface. Nothing. I expanded to 30 yards. Nothing. I went out to 50 yards in each cardinal direction. Clean, settled, undisturbed snow in every direction. The only marks in the area were Marin's tracks from yesterday and our tracks from today. I came back to the camera and examined the housing without opening it. Both latches were fully engaged. I checked for scratches, tool marks, pry damage, or any sign of forced entry. The housing was clean. Not new, it had the normal scuffing of field equipment, but there was no indication that anything had been forced. I put on nitrile gloves, released both latches, and opened the housing. The camera was powered on. The battery indicator showed 71%. The lens was clean. The infrared sensor was active. The mounting bracket was secure. Everything about the unit was exactly as it should have been. Except the SD card slot was empty. I checked the internal log again myself. Marin read over my shoulder. There were 2 entries. The first was from November 30th at 2:14 p.m. Housing opened. That was when Marin had originally deployed the camera. The second was from December 12th at 3:47 a.m. Housing opened. No third entry, meaning whoever opened it at 3:47 a.m. had also closed it, and the system had registered the closure as part of the same event, which only happens when the housing is opened and closed within a 60-second window. Whoever did this had opened the case, removed the card, and resealed the housing in under a minute. In the dark, in -20-degree cold, without leaving a single footprint. I sealed the camera in an evidence bag. Marin replaced it with the fresh unit she'd brought, positioning it at the same angle on the same pole. Then we stood on that bench in the dying light and looked east. The Kilbuck foothills were invisible behind the cloud ceiling, but you could feel them out there, the land rising, the air moving differently as it came down off the higher terrain. The drainage below us was a shallow white crease in the tundra, curving northeast toward the mountains. Marin said, "I want to show you something." She pulled a small laptop from her pack, opened it, and loaded a file. "This is from Station 2. It's about 4 miles south of here, covering a different section of the drainage. I pulled this footage 3 days ago." The screen showed a nighttime infrared image, gray-green, slightly grainy, the familiar look of a trail camera in darkness. The timestamp read December 8th, 1:17 a.m. The frame showed an open section of tundra with the drainage visible as a dark line at the bottom of the image. 7 caribou stood in the center of the frame. They were arranged in a loose line, all facing east. None of them were moving. Their heads were up, ears forward, bodies rigid. They looked like animals that had heard something and frozen in place. The clip ran for 30 seconds. Not one animal moved. Not an ear, not a tail, not a shift of weight from one leg to another. 7 living animals standing in -20-degree darkness, motionless as stones. Marin advanced to the next clip. Same camera, same location. Timestamp, December 8th, 1:38 a.m., 21 minutes later. The caribou were in exactly the same position, identical, as though the 21 minutes between clips had not occurred. She showed me the next clip. 2:14 a.m., same position. Then 3:02 a.m., same. Then 3:47 a.m. I noticed the time. 3:47. Marin nodded. Same minute as the housing breach on Station 4. In the 3:47 clip, the caribou were gone. The frame was empty. No animals. No tracks visible in the infrared image, although the resolution wasn't high enough to be certain. Just empty tundra and the dark crease of the drainage. She closed the laptop. 7 caribou stood motionless for over 2 hours in sub-zero darkness, facing east. And at the exact minute that someone opened my camera 14 miles to the north, they vanished. I didn't respond immediately. I was running through explanations. Coincidence was possible. Animals spook and move. Timestamps on separate devices could have minor synchronization errors. The correlation could be meaningless. But the stillness of those animals was not normal. Caribou don't stand immobile in the open in deep cold for 2 hours. They bed down. They move to conserve heat. Standing motionless in extreme cold is metabolically wasteful and exposes them to predators. No behavioral model accounts for it. We packed up and started back toward Marin's camp. The light was nearly gone, and we switched on headlamps for the last mile. The beams cut narrow white tunnels through the darkness, illuminating only the snow directly ahead. The world outside those beams was absolute black. Halfway back, Marin stopped walking. I stopped behind her. What? Listen. I turned off my headlamp. She turned off hers. We stood in total darkness. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. The silence was immense, the kind of silence that has texture, that feels like pressure against the inner ear. Then I heard it. A low sound. Not wind, not mechanical, not animal in any way I could categorize. It was deep, near the bottom edge of what human hearing can detect, and it pulsed. Not rhythmically, not like a heartbeat or a machine. It pulsed in clusters. 2 beats close together, a pause, 3 beats, a longer pause, 1 beat. Then silence. Then the pattern repeated, but not identically. The intervals shifted, the groupings changed. It was structured. It was not random. And it was coming from the east. How long have you been hearing this? I asked. 3 nights, she said. Only between midnight and 4 a.m. Only when the wind drops below 5 miles per hour. It's too low to record on my equipment. I've tried. The frequency is below the range of my audio recorders. Infrasound? No. Infrasound is below human hearing. I can hear this. It's just barely audible. Right at the threshold. 18, maybe 19 hertz. She was right. The sound existed at the very edge of perception. You could feel it as much as hear it. A sensation in the chest and behind the eyes, as much as in the ears. It produced a vague sense of unease, which is a documented physiological response to frequencies near the infrasound boundary. I knew that. I told myself that. The unease is mechanical, not meaningful. Your body responds to low frequencies with anxiety because those frequencies are associated with large environmental events. Earthquakes, avalanches, volcanic activity. It's an evolved warning system. But the sound was patterned. And patterns imply a source that organizes, rather than simply produces. We stood in the darkness for 6 or 7 minutes, listening. The pulsing continued. It did not intensify. It did not fade. It simply persisted, emanating from somewhere to the east, impossible to localize precisely. Because low-frequency sound propagates omnidirectionally, and human binaural hearing cannot accurately determine the origin of frequencies below about 80 hertz. Then it stopped. Not faded, stopped. Mid-pattern, as though the source had been switched off. We turned our headlamps back on and walked the rest of the way to Marin's camp without speaking. At camp, I told Marin I wanted to stay the night and make a run toward the Killbuck foothills at first light. She agreed. She had a second sleeping pad and a spare bag rated to -30. I radioed Thomas Alexei on the VHF to let him know I'd be out overnight, per protocol. Thomas acknowledged. Then, after a pause, he said, "How far east are you, Ashcroft?" 14 miles. Dr. Caldwell's camp. Another pause. Don't go further tonight. I told him we weren't planning to. We were going to sleep and head east at first light. The pause this time was longer. Be back before dark. I said we would. He didn't sign off with his usual Thomas out. He just released the transmit button and the channel went to static. That night, inside Marin's tent, with the wind picking up outside and the temperature dropping toward -30, we talked. Not about the cameras or the caribou or the sound. We talked about our careers. She told me about her doctoral work in Fairbanks, about spending 2 years studying caribou in the western Arctic herd, and becoming convinced that there were influences on migration that didn't appear in any existing model. She told me she'd found references in Yupik oral histories to a phenomenon in the Kilbook region that elders described as the land calling, not a metaphor, a literal description of the land producing sound. I told her about the footprints. I described them in detail, the stride, the consistency, the termination. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "I spoke with Dale Riggins before I came here." That surprised me. Trask had told me Riggins had retired. How did you find him? He published a letter in an internal Fish and Wildlife bulletin about 2 years ago. 13 lines. It was framed as a procedural recommendation. He suggested that the Harrow Station's patrol zone be restricted to a 10-mile radius from town. No justification, no data. Just the recommendation. It was ignored. I tracked him down through the bulletin editor. "What did he tell you?" She was quiet for a while. The tent fabric snapped in a gust. He told me that in February of 2008, during a routine patrol east of Harrow, he found a caribou standing alone in the open tundra about 16 miles from town. The animal was alive, but completely immobile. Not injured, not trapped, just standing. He approached it on the snow machine and it didn't react. He got within 10 feet and it didn't move. Its eyes were open. It was breathing, but it was rigid, like it had been switched off. She paused. He said he touched it, put his hand on its flank. It was warm, alive, but it didn't respond to his touch at all. He said it was like touching a piece of warm furniture. What did he do? He backed away. He said the moment he got about 30 feet from the animal, he felt something he described as a tension. Not a sound, not a visual, a sensation of being watched with tremendous focus. He said it was the most intense and specific feeling he'd ever experienced. Not fear exactly, but the absolute certainty that something was aware of him. And then? He left, drove back to Harrow, put in his reassignment request the next day. When I asked him why, he said something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. What was it? He said, "It wasn't watching me the way a predator watches. It was watching me the way a person watches someone who just walked into a room they weren't supposed to enter." I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the wind and didn't sleep for a long time. I thought about Dale Riggins, a competent, experienced officer with 11 years in Alaska, putting in a reassignment request the day after an encounter he couldn't explain. Not because he was frightened, necessarily. Because he recognized that he was in the presence of something that operated on a scale he couldn't measure. And the professional response to that recognition was to withdraw. I understood the impulse. But I also knew that withdrawing was exactly what every officer before me had done. And the result was a station that couldn't keep personnel for more than one winter. Whatever was out there, and I was increasingly convinced that something was, it had created a pattern of institutional avoidance that left the Eastern Unit functionally unsupervised. And in that absence, something was taking data cards from research cameras and standing caribou in the dark like pieces on a board. I was not going to withdraw. Morning came, if you can call it that. The sky lightened to a dim gray around 11, and we were already packed and moving by 11:30. We headed east into the foothills. The terrain changed gradually. The flat tundra gave way to low, rolling hills, the vegetation shifting from open ground to patches of dwarf willow and alder that grew denser as we gained elevation. The snow was deeper here, 2 feet in the sheltered areas. Wind scoured to a few inches on the exposed ridges. Travel was harder. We were on snowshoes, moving at about 2 miles per hour, breathing hard in the cold air. We didn't talk much. We were watching the ground, watching the landscape, watching for anything out of place. For the first 2 miles, there was nothing. Normal winter terrain. No tracks, no sound, no sign of anything unusual. At about 16 miles from Harrow, the terrain pinched into a narrow valley between 2 ridges. The drainage we'd been following funneled through this gap, and the willows along its banks grew thick enough to form a low canopy. It was the first enclosed space we'd encountered since leaving camp. And I felt the change immediately. The openness of the tundra was replaced by a claustrophobic tunnel of gray branches and snow. Marin stopped at the entrance to the valley. She was looking at the ground. I moved up beside her and looked down. Tracks, not footprints this time. Caribou tracks, dozens of them, overlapping, compressed into a dense pattern that covered the snow surface for 30 or 40 feet in every direction. A large group of animals had gathered here. They had milled in a tight cluster, circling, their hooves churning the snow into a packed platform. And then they had all walked east, into the valley, in a single file line. I counted the individual track lines, 14 animals, walking one behind the other with the same mechanical precision I'd seen in the human footprints on the ridgeline. Even spacing, consistent stride, no deviation. The line of tracks entered the narrow valley and disappeared into the willows, but no tracks came out. I looked at Marin. She was already scanning the valley with binoculars. "I can see the tracks going in," she said. "They continue for at least 200 yards. After that, the willows are too thick to see the ground." "Any tracks exiting? Anywhere along the ridgeline?" She glassed both ridges slowly, systematically. "Nothing. Clean snow on both sides. They went in and they didn't come out." 14 caribou had walked single file into a narrow valley and vanished. I checked my watch. It was 12:40. We had about 3 hours of usable light. The valley extended maybe a mile to the east before opening into a broader basin at the foot of the Kilbuck slopes. I could see the terrain on the map. I knew the distances. I knew the light. "We follow them," I said. Marin nodded. She didn't hesitate. Whatever reservation she might have had was outweighed by the same thing that was driving me, the need to see what was at the end of those tracks. Not because we were reckless, because we were professionals who had exhausted every remote explanation. And the only remaining method of investigation was direct observation. We entered the valley. The willows closed over us within 50 yards. Not fully. The canopy was only about 7 feet high, and we could still see the sky through the branches, but the sense of enclosure was immediate and oppressive. The caribou tracks continued ahead of us, single file, precise and unwavering. The snow beneath the willows was softer, and the tracks were deeply impressed, showing clear hoof detail. These were healthy animals at normal body weight. They had walked calmly into this valley. No running, no panic, just a steady, deliberate procession. At about 300 yards in, I noticed something wrong with the snow. Not the tracks, the snow itself. It was warmer. I stopped and pulled off my glove and pressed my bare hand into the snow beside the trail. It was several degrees warmer than it should have been. Not melting, still well below freezing, but noticeably warmer than the snow we'd been walking through all morning. I dug down about 6 inches, and the temperature differential increased, The deeper snow felt almost temperate. This made no sense. The ground should have been frozen solid to a depth of several feet. There was no geothermal activity mapped anywhere in the Kilbuck foothills. No hot springs, no volcanic signature. Maren felt it too. She knelt and pressed her thermometer probe into the snow at various depths. At the surface, -12 Celsius. At 6 inches, -4. At 12 inches, +2. "That's above freezing," she said. She looked up at me. 12 inches down, in December, in western Alaska. The subsurface temperature is above freezing. I looked at the caribou tracks continuing ahead of us into the willows, and I understood something. The animals hadn't been displaced by something chasing them. They'd been drawn. Whatever was ahead of us was producing heat. And in the deepest part of an Arctic winter, heat is the most powerful attractant there is. Every living thing moves toward warmth. We kept walking. The valley narrowed further. The ridges on either side steepened. The willows grew denser, and the temperature continued to rise. By the time we'd covered half a mile, the air itself was warmer, not dramatically, but enough that I unzipped my outer shell. Maren did the same. The snow on the ground was visibly softer, and in sheltered spots near the base of the willows, I could see exposed ground, dark soil, unfrozen, in December. The caribou tracks were changing too. The impressions were shallower as the snow softened, but they continued still single file, still precise, still heading east. Whatever discipline held those animals in formation was operating regardless of the changing terrain beneath their hooves. At approximately the half-mile mark, we found the first caribou. It was standing in a small clearing among the willows, about 40 feet to our left. A cow, adult, healthy weight, thick winter coat. She was standing perfectly still, facing east, head up, ears forward. She did not react to our presence. She did not turn her head. She did not flick an ear or shift her weight. Maren and I both stopped. We watched the animal for a full minute. It did not move. "That's one of them," Maren whispered. "That's one of the animals from my study group. I recognize the ear tag yellow number 31. I tagged her myself last spring." I took a step toward the caribou. Nothing. I took another. The animal stood like a sculpture. I got within 15 feet and stopped. Her eyes were open. Her sides moved slightly with breathing. A thin plume of condensation rose from her nostrils with each exhale. She was alive and conscious, but she was somewhere else. Whatever her senses were attending to, it wasn't us. I thought of Dale Riggins, warm furniture. Maren circled wide and came up on the other side of the clearing. She moved slowly, keeping her voice low. Her respiration is normal. Coat condition is excellent. There's no sign of disease or injury. She paused. But look at her hooves. I looked down. The caribou's hooves were planted in bare soil. The snow had melted completely in the immediate area around where she stood. A circle of dark, unfrozen earth, about 4 feet in diameter, with the animal standing precisely at its center. Not packed down by her weight. Melted. The soil was moist and soft, and at the edges of the circle, you could see the transition frozen white snow giving way to dark, wet earth over a distance of about 6 inches. The caribou was producing a heat signature, or something was producing one through her. I stepped back. Maren stepped back. We looked at each other across the clearing, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw something other than professional composure on her face. Not fear, bewilderment, the expression of someone whose entire framework for understanding the natural world had just been shown to be incomplete. We continued east. Within the next 200 yards, we found 6 more caribou, all standing, all motionless, all facing east, all surrounded by perfect circles of melted snow. Each animal was healthy, breathing, and completely unresponsive. The circles varied in diameter from 3 to 5 feet, but everyone was precisely centered on the animal within it. The spacing between animals was irregular. Some were 50 feet apart, some 200, but they were all on the same heading, all facing the same direction, all locked in the same impossible stillness. 7 caribou. Marin had documented 7 caribou in the trail camera footage from Station 2, the same 7 that had stood motionless for 2 hours on December 8th. 7 of 14. The tracks entering the valley had shown 14 animals. The remaining 7 were further in. I checked my watch. 1:45. The light was already deteriorating. We had an hour, maybe 90 minutes, before darkness would make the return trip dangerous. The valley continued eastward ahead of us, the willows giving way to open ground as the terrain began to climb toward the Kilbuck slopes. Somewhere ahead, the remaining 7 caribou were standing in their circles of melted earth, facing whatever lay at the end of this procession. Every professional instinct told me to turn around. We had observed enough to document the anomaly. We had GPS coordinates, temperature readings, behavioral observations. We could return to Harrow, file a report, request additional resources, and come back with a proper team. But I also knew what would happen if I filed that report. I knew because I'd read between the lines of Dale Riggins' bulletin letter, and because I understood how institutions handle information they cannot categorize. The report would be received. It would be reviewed. It would be flagged as inconclusive. And the recommendation, if any recommendation came at all, would be the same one Riggins had made and been ignored on. Restrict the patrol zone. Stay away. The institution's response to the inexplicable was avoidance. It always had been. Marin was watching me. She didn't ask what I wanted to do. She waited. I looked east into the darkening valley. I looked back west toward Harrow, toward the cabin, toward the satellite phone and the VHF and the institutional framework that would tell me to go home. 30 more minutes, I said. Then we turn around regardless. She adjusted her pack and we moved forward. The valley opened sooner than the map had suggested. Within 200 yards, the willows thinned and fell away, and we stepped out onto a broad apron of ground that rose gently toward the first real slopes of the Kilbucks. The snow here was almost gone. Not melted into slush or pooled water, simply absent, as though the ground refused to hold it. The soil was dark and bare, and warm enough that I could feel it through my boot soles. Small green shoots, actual vegetation, alive and growing, pushed through the earth in scattered clusters. In December, in western Alaska, at a latitude where nothing green exists above the snowpack for 6 months of the year, Marin knelt and touched one of the shoots. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she pulled out her thermometer probe and pressed it into the soil. 11 degrees Celsius, she said. 52 Fahrenheit, 12 inches below the surface. The air temperature around us was still well below freezing, my breath still clouded. The sky was the same iron gray. But the ground beneath our feet was producing springtime temperatures. And whatever generated that heat was powerful enough to sustain plant growth in the dead of the deepest Arctic winter. We found the remaining 7 caribou within the next 100 yards. They were arranged differently from the others. Not scattered through the willows, but positioned in a rough semicircle, all facing the same point on the rising slope ahead. Their spacing was even about 30 feet between each animal, and they stood with the same absolute stillness as the others. Breathing, alive, present in every biological sense, but attending to something that had no visible source. The circles of bare earth around these animals were larger, 8 to 10 feet in diameter, and the soil within them was different, darker, richer, with a texture I didn't recognize. Not the sandy gravel typical of this region. Something finer, almost loamy, like soil that had been cultivated. I stopped at the edge of the semicircle and looked at where the animals were facing. 30 yards ahead, the slope steepened slightly and then leveled into a natural shelf, a flat area maybe 50 feet across, backed by a low rock outcrop. The shelf was completely bare of snow. The soil was the same dark loam. And in the center of the shelf, something was wrong with the ground. I don't know how else to describe it. The ground was moving. Not shifting, not settling, not cracking, moving. The soil surface was rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic undulation, like the chest of something breathing. The amplitude was small, maybe an inch of rise and fall, but it was visible and unmistakable. A circle of earth, approximately 15 feet in diameter, was respiring. The cycle was slow. One full rise and fall took about 8 seconds. Marin saw it at the same time I did. She grabbed my arm. Not in panic, in the reflexive way a person grabs something solid when the ground stops being trustworthy. We stood at the edge of that semicircle of frozen caribou and watched the earth breathe. I counted cycles, 8 seconds each, consistent. The motion was smooth, not mechanical. It had the organic quality of a living process rather than a geological one. At the peak of each rise, the soil surface caught the dim light, and I could see moisture glistening. At the trough, small fractures opened and closed along the perimeter. The fractures weren't random. They formed a pattern, concentric rings radiating outward from the center, evenly spaced, geometrically precise. "That's not geothermal," Marin said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Geothermal doesn't pulse. Geothermal doesn't form rings." She was right. I had seen geothermal features: hot springs, fumaroles, mud pots. They steam, they bubble. They produce irregular, chaotic surface activity. This was none of those things. This was ordered, rhythmic, deliberate. I looked at my watch. 2:05. We had used 10 of our 30 minutes. I took a step forward. Marin didn't follow. I took another step, moving past the nearest caribou, a large bull, heavy-bodied, antlers still intact, standing in his circle of dark earth like a monument. I passed within 5 feet of him. His eyes were open, and his pupil contracted slightly as my shadow crossed his face. But he didn't move. His nostrils flared once. Then stillness again. I advanced to within 20 feet of the breathing ground. The warmth was remarkable. The air at this distance was above freezing. I could feel it on the exposed skin of my face. A soft warmth that had no business existing in this place at this time of year. It carried a smell. Not sulfur, not rot. Something organic but unfamiliar. Like turned earth in spring mixed with something older, something mineral. The smell of deep stone that has never been exposed to air. I crouched and studied the surface. The soil in the undulating area was different from the soil around it. It was almost black, fine-grained, and wet without being muddy. It looked like the richest garden soil I'd ever seen. And through it, partially visible at the surface, I could see thin white filaments, thousands of them. A dense network of thread-like structures woven through the top few inches of soil, pulsing faintly in synchronization with the breathing of the ground. They looked biological. They looked like mycelium, the underground network of a fungal organism, but no mycelium I'd ever seen pulsed with visible rhythm or grew in soil heated to springtime temperatures in the Arctic winter. The filaments extended outward from the center in every direction. I traced them with my eyes. They ran through the dark soil, under the bare ground, toward the caribou. I stood up and walked to the nearest animal, the bull, and looked at the earth beneath his hooves. The filaments were there. They ran directly under the animal, and where they contacted the soil nearest to his hooves, they were thicker, denser, more organized. They formed a mat beneath each hoof that looked almost intentional, like a root system reaching up to meet the animal standing above it. I looked at the other caribou. Every animal in the semicircle stood on one of these convergence points. The filament network connected them all back to the central undulating area like spokes connecting to a hub. The caribou weren't just standing near whatever this was. They were connected to it. I backed away slowly and returned to Marin. She was photographing everything with a small digital camera, working methodically, hands steady despite whatever she was feeling. The filaments run under the animals, I told her. I can see them from here, she said. They're also running west, back through the willows. I noticed them in the soil on the way in. I thought they were root structures from the willow bushes. They're not. They're the same organism. I thought about the warm snow in the valley, the melted circles around the 7 caribou we'd found in the willows, the bare ground beneath our feet. All of it connected by an underground network of pulsing white filaments that radiated from this single point on the mountainside. How large is this thing? I asked. Marin lowered the camera and looked at me. We've been walking through it for half a mile, at minimum. I absorbed that. Half a mile. A subsurface organism extending at least half a mile from its center. Heating the ground above it, melting the snow, growing vegetation in winter, and connecting itself to large mammals through a filament network that somehow rendered those animals immobile and unresponsive. Nothing in my experience or training provided a framework for this. Nothing in Marin's either. I could see it in her face, not the bewilderment from the clearing, but something colder. The recognition that her entire field of study had just been revealed as a subset of something far larger. I checked my watch. 2:15. 15 minutes remaining. We need to collect a sample, Marin said. Soil and filament. If we don't bring physical evidence out, none of this is verifiable. She was right. Observations and photographs were valuable, but a physical sample would be the difference between a report that got flagged as inconclusive and one that triggered actual scientific investigation. I nodded. She pulled a sterile collection vial from her pack and walked toward the edge of the undulating area. I followed, staying 2 steps behind. She chose a spot about 5 feet from the perimeter of the breathing circle, knelt, and pressed the open vial into the soil to scoop a core of earth and filaments. The breathing stopped. Not gradually, not in the way a rhythm slows to a halt. The undulation ceased between one cycle and the next, as though a switch had been turned. One moment the ground was rising. The next, it was still. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it, was the silence of something that had been doing something and had stopped doing it because it was now paying attention to something else. Marin froze, her hand still holding the vial pressed into the soil. The caribou moved, all 14 of them, simultaneously. Not running, not startling. They simply turned their heads, Every animal in the semicircle and, from what I could hear behind me, every animal in the willows turned to face us. I heard the ones in the willows because the motion of 14 large animals rotating in place produced a collective sound, hooves shifting, bodies adjusting that carried through the still air. 28 eyes looked at us, not with the blank vacancy they'd shown before, with focus, with the directed, purposeful attention of animals that had been made aware of our presence by something other than their own senses. Marin slowly withdrew the vial from the soil. It was half full, dark earth and a clump of white filaments visible through the clear plastic. She capped it without looking down, her eyes on the caribou. The bull nearest to us took a step forward. One step, then he stopped. He lowered his head, not in a threat posture, not in a grazing motion. He lowered it until his nose nearly touched the ground, and he exhaled. A long, slow breath that sent a plume of condensation rolling across the dark soil toward our feet. The filaments beneath the bull's hooves brightened. That is the only word for it. The white threads became more visible, as though they were producing their own faint luminescence. The brightness traveled along the network away from the bull, toward the central circle, and then outward along other spokes to the other animals. Within seconds, the entire visible network was faintly glowing. A web of cold white light beneath the surface of the earth, connecting 14 motionless animals to a single point on the mountainside. Then the sound began. The same low pulsing we'd heard the night before from Marin's camp, but here, at the source, was not at the edge of perception. It was present, physical. I felt it in my sternum and in the bones of my skull. The clustered pulses 2, pause, 3, pause, 1 but louder, more defined, and accompanied by something I hadn't detected at a distance, a tonal quality. Each pulse carried a pitch. The pitches varied. They formed sequences. Marin grabbed my arm again. That's not random. Those are intervals. Ashcroft, those are musical intervals. She was right. I don't have formal musical training, but I could hear it. The pitches were related to each other by consistent ratios. The sound wasn't just structured, it was structured in a way that followed harmonic relationships. This was not the groan of shifting earth or the resonance of wind through a rock. This was organized sound produced by something that understood the mathematical relationships between frequencies. The pulsing continued for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it stopped. The filaments dimmed. The caribou raised their heads. They turned away from us, all 14, and resumed their eastward facing. The ground began to breathe again. 1 inch rise, 1 inch fall, 8-second cycle. We had been dismissed. I didn't interpret that in the moment. That interpretation came later, in the weeks and months that followed. In the moment, all I knew was that the situation had changed. Something had noticed us, had responded to Marin taking the sample, had demonstrated a capacity I couldn't explain, and had then returned to whatever it had been doing before we arrived. The interaction had been brief, controlled, and unambiguous. It knew we were there. It could direct the caribou. It communicated in structured sound, and it had chosen not to prevent us from taking the sample. "We go now," I said. Marin pocketed the vial. We turned west and walked. I have replayed that walk many times. The return through the willows, past the 7 caribou still standing in their melted circles, out of the warm valley and into the frozen tundra beyond. The temperature dropping with every 100 yards, the cold closing back around us like water filling a space we'd briefly displaced. The light failing, the snow hardening under our snowshoes, the normal world reasserting itself with every step. Neither of us spoke until we reached Marin's camp. By then it was full dark 4:30 in the afternoon, black as midnight, the stars invisible behind the overcast. We ducked into her tent and sat in the glow of a single LED lantern and looked at each other across the small space. Marin held up the vial. The soil inside was dark. The filaments were no longer glowing. They looked like ordinary white threads, indistinguishable from common mycelium. "I need to get this to a lab," she said. "Fairbanks?" "Fairbanks first. Then maybe Woods Hole or USGS. Someone with the equipment to analyze whatever those filaments are." She turned the vial slowly in her fingers. "This is either the most significant biological discovery in decades, or I've collected a tube of ordinary fungus, and everything we saw today was a shared hallucination induced by infrasound exposure." "You don't believe that?" "No," she said. "I don't. But I need to behave as though it's possible until the lab results tell me otherwise. That's how this works." I respected that. It was exactly the discipline the situation required. We had witnessed something extraordinary. But extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And a tube of soil was not enough. We needed analysis. We needed data. We needed someone with the right instruments to look at those filaments and tell us what they were. I stayed at Marin's camp that night. I didn't sleep well. The pulsing didn't return. The wind was above the threshold she'd identified, and the sound seemed to require calm air to propagate. But I lay awake thinking about the network. The filaments running underground, connecting the caribou to the central organism, extending at least half a mile through the valley. The heat it generated, the sound it produced, the way it had responded to Marin, taking the sample not with aggression, but with awareness. A momentary attention that surveyed us, communicated something, and withdrew. Dale Riggins had been right. It wasn't watching like a predator. It was watching like something that noticed an intrusion and decided it didn't matter enough to act on. The next morning, I returned to Harrow. I went straight to Thomas Alexi's office in the public safety building, a small room with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a VHF base station. Thomas was there. He looked at me when I walked in, and something in my face must have told him where I'd been, because he set down his coffee and waited. I sat down and told him everything. I told him about the camera, the caribou footage, the footprints from October, the sound, the valley, the warm ground, the filaments, the breathing earth, the semicircle of animals, the glow, the structured sound, all of it. Thomas listened without interrupting. His face didn't change. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My grandmother told me about this when I was 11 years old." I waited. "She said the land east of here has a heartbeat. She said it has always had one. She said the animals know it, and the people used to know it. And then the people forgot because knowing was too heavy to carry every day. She said it doesn't hurt anything. It just lives there, under the ground. And it's been living there since before there were people." "Did she say what it was?" Thomas looked at me with patience. "She said it was the land. Not something in the land. The land. You're making a distinction she wouldn't have made." I thought about that. In my framework, the federal framework, the scientific framework, the framework that organized the world into categories, the organism in the valley was something separate from the ground it inhabited. A biological entity embedded in geological substrate. But Thomas was describing a worldview in which that separation didn't exist. The organism wasn't in the land. It was the land. The filaments, the heat, the sound, the caribou standing in their melted circles, these were not symptoms of an organism. They were the land expressing itself. I couldn't adopt that framework. My training wouldn't allow it. But I could hold it alongside my own and recognize that it described the same phenomenon from a different angle. "Thomas," I said, "why doesn't anyone from Harrow go east in winter?" "Because that's when it's awake," he said. "Summer, it sleeps. The ground is warm all through and it doesn't need to work to keep itself alive. Winter, it wakes up. It pulls heat from deep down. It calls the animals in. It's been doing this forever. We don't go east in winter because you don't walk into someone's house while they're busy." But I did. Yes. And it noticed. Thomas picked up his coffee and took a long sip. "The caribou came back." I didn't understand what he meant. "Every year," he said, "the caribou go east in October and they come back in March, healthy, fat. The cows calve strong in spring. Whatever happens to them in there, it doesn't hurt them. They go in and they come back, and they're better than when they left." He set the coffee down. "The rangers don't come back. They go east, and they see something they can't carry, and they leave. Not leave the valley, leave Harrow. Leave Alaska, every one of you." He looked at me steadily. "The question isn't what's out there, Ashcroft. It's whether you're going to be the one who stays." I left Thomas's office and walked back to my cabin through town. It was early afternoon, -22, the light already starting to go. Harrow was quiet, a few snow machines moving between buildings, smoke rising from wood stoves, the generator at the fuel depot humming. Ordinary life. 400 people going about their winter routines within 2 miles of something that defied every institutional category I possessed. They knew. Not all of them, maybe, but enough. The knowledge lived in the community the way Thomas had described, not as superstition or fear, but as practical boundary. You don't go east in winter, the same way you don't cross thin ice or camp in a drainage during rain. A rule derived from long observation and maintained through quiet consensus. The difference between their knowledge and mine was that they had integrated it. It was part of how they lived. For me, it was a crisis, a professional, scientific, personal crisis that demanded action, demanded reporting, demanded the institutional machinery that I represented. I sat in my cabin and looked at the satellite phone. If I called Trask, what would I say? I found a massive subterranean organism in the Killbuck foothills that controls caribou through a mycelial network and communicates in harmonic frequencies. Send a team. I knew exactly what would happen. Trask would ask if I was feeling all right. He would suggest I take a few days. He might arrange a mental health check. If I persisted, the report would be filed and reviewed by someone who had never stood on warm ground in December and watched the earth breathe. It would be categorized as inconclusive. The recommendation would be to restrict the patrol zone. The station would go vacant again. That pattern had repeated for years, maybe decades. The institution sent someone. The someone found the phenomenon. The institution failed to process what they reported. The someone left. The station emptied. The phenomenon continued undisturbed. Marin had the sample. Marin had the scientific credentials and the laboratory connections to get it analyzed outside the enforcement chain. That was the path with the best chance of producing a response the institution couldn't ignore. Hard data, molecular analysis, peer-reviewed publication, if it came to that. I picked up the satellite phone and called Marin instead of Trask. I told her I would not be filing a report through my chain of command. I told her the sample was the priority and that she should get it to Fairbanks as soon as weather allowed a charter flight. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been looking at the filaments under a hand lens. Ashcroft, they're moving. They're not just alive, they're active. They're reorganizing inside the vial. What do you mean, reorganizing? When I collected the sample, the filaments were randomly distributed through the soil, just a tangle of threads. Right now, 12 hours later, they've arranged themselves into a radial pattern. They're oriented, all of them. They're pointing east. A long silence on the line. How is that possible in a sealed container? I asked. It's not, she said. That's the point. I ended the call. I sat in my cabin as the darkness came down, and the temperature dropped and the wind built from the northeast, from the killbucks, always from the killbucks, and I thought about what Thomas had asked me. Whether I was going to be the one who stays. The next 10 days were the most professionally conflicted period of my career. Marin attempted to arrange transport for the sample to Fairbanks 3 times. The first charter was canceled due to weather. A storm system parked over the Kuskokwim Basin for 4 days, dumping snow and dropping visibility to 0. The second charter developed a mechanical issue in Bethel and turned back. The third was available but couldn't land at Harrow due to crosswinds exceeding the strip's safety margin. During those 10 days, Marin continued her observations from camp. She checked her camera stations on the established rotation. The replacement camera at Station 4 captured footage every night. She shared the clips with me over the satellite phone, describing what she saw. Every night between 1 and 4 a.m., caribou appeared in the frame. Groups of varying size, sometimes 4, sometimes 12, sometimes as many as 20. They walked east, single file, same mechanical precision, same unwavering heading. They walked through the frame and disappeared into the darkness toward the Killbuck foothills. Every morning, caribou appeared in the frame walking west. Same file, same precision, returning. And Marin reported that the returning animals were, by every visible measure, healthy. Coats thick, body condition strong. Movement fluid and normal once they broke from the single file formation about a mile west of the valley. They were going in every night and coming out every morning. The organism was receiving them and releasing them on a cycle. And whatever it was doing to them, or with them, or for them, it was not harmful. Thomas had been right. The animals came back better. But the sample was changing. Marin reported daily. The filaments in the sealed vial continued to reorganize. By day 3, they had formed a tight radial pattern, all oriented east. By day 5, they had begun to extend, growing slowly, pressing against the glass walls of the vial. By day 7, fine cracks appeared in the vial's plastic cap. Not from pressure. The filaments were dissolving the plastic. Marin transferred the sample to a glass container with a ground glass stopper, the most chemically resistant vessel she had in her field kit. By day 9, the filaments had grown enough to fill the new container. They pressed against the glass in organized patterns, not random growth, but geometric, concentric rings, the same pattern I'd seen in the fractures around the breathing circle on the mountainside. The sample was not inert material removed from a living system. It was a piece of the system, and it was still operating according to the system's logic. In a sealed glass container in a tent 14 miles from its source, it was growing, orienting, and organizing itself with the same purposeful behavior we'd observed in the field. On the morning of December 24th, I made my routine VHF call to Marin at 8 a.m. She didn't answer. I tried again at 8:15. No response. I tried the satellite phone. It rang 6 times and went to the automated message. I tried the VHF again at 8:30, 8:45, and 9. Nothing on any channel. Protocol was clear. 2 missed consecutive check-ins, and I go out. She had missed the evening check-in the previous night. As well, I had noted it, but attributed it to a battery issue or a late return from a camera station. In hindsight, I should have acted on the first missed check-in. I didn't because the weather had been stable, and because Marin was competent, and because I'd allowed professional trust to override procedural discipline. That was my error. I was on the snow machine by 9:20, running east in full darkness. Headlamp on. Temperature -28. No wind, which meant the snow surface was fast and the machine ran well. But the stillness carried its own weight. The beam of the headlamp carved a narrow corridor through the black, and everything outside that corridor was absence. I reached Marin's camp at 10:05. The tent was standing. The cooking shelter was intact. The battery bank was powered, and the solar panels were stowed correctly. Her snowshoes were gone. Her daypack was gone. One satellite phone was in its cradle inside the tent. That was the one I'd been calling. The other was not in the tent. Her VHF handset was sitting on top of her sleeping bag, powered off. That stopped me. Marin was meticulous about communication equipment. She would not have left camp without a powered VHF unless she intended to be unreachable. That was not carelessness. That was a choice. I checked the tent systematically. Her field notebook was on the sleeping pad, open to a page dated December 23rd. Her handwriting was the same precise, small, organized. The entry read, Camera 4 captured continuous footage, overnight, December 22nd to December 23rd. Activity began at 00:47 and did not stop. Not individual groups, a continuous procession. Hundreds of animals. I counted frames and estimated 300+ caribou moving east through the camera's field of view in a single unbroken column over approximately 4 hours. This exceeds the known population of the study herd by at least 150%. Animals are coming from outside the survey area. Whatever is calling them in, its range of influence is expanding. Below that, separated by a line. Sample container cracked at 1540 yesterday. Filaments breached containment. They are in the soil under the tent. I can feel warmth through the floor of the tent, where there was no warmth before. The organism has established a node here. It grew from a sealed sample to a subsurface presence in 11 days. Below that, in handwriting that was slightly less controlled, I am going east. I need to understand what is happening on the nights when the full column moves. I believe the organism is doing something cyclical, building toward a peak event. The nightly processions are increasing in size. Something is approaching. I am going to observe from the ridge above the valley, at the entrance to the foothills. I will be back before morning. If I am not, the data is on the laptop. The sample is no longer containable. Do not attempt to collect another one. I read the entry twice. I set the notebook down. I went outside and found her snowshoe tracks leading east from camp, clear and sharp in the hard snow, heading toward the Killbuck foothills. It was 10:20 a.m. She had left camp sometime the previous afternoon or evening. That meant she had been out for at least 14 hours, possibly longer, in -20-degree darkness, and alone, without communication equipment. I followed her tracks. The snow machine carried me the first several miles, tracking alongside her snowshoe prints. The prints were steady, well-spaced, the gait of someone moving with purpose rather than haste. She had not been frightened when she left. She had been deliberate, a scientist moving toward data. At about 11 miles east of camp, roughly 25 miles from Harrow, the terrain steepened and the snow machine became impractical. I parked it, shouldered my pack, strapped on my own snowshoes, and continued on foot. Her tracks climbed a long ridge that paralleled the valley we had explored together 11 days earlier. She was approaching from the south this time, taking a higher line that would give her an overlook position without entering the valley floor. The warmth began about a mile from the ridgeline. The same gradual transition, snow softening, air temperature rising, the impossible spring lurking beneath the surface of deep winter. I unzipped my shell and kept moving. Her tracks continued ahead of me, steady and sure. I crested the ridge at 11:40. The light was at its peak, a dim gray wash that barely distinguished ground from sky. Below me, the valley opened east toward the Kilbuck slopes. I stopped. The valley floor was covered with caribou, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. They filled the valley from wall to wall, a vast herd standing motionless on bare, dark ground, every animal facing east. The snow was gone from the entire valley a mile long, perhaps a quarter-mile wide. All of it bare earth, all of it warm, all of it threaded with a white filament network that I could see glowing faintly even in the thin daylight. The glow was stronger than what we'd seen before. The filaments formed a continuous luminous web across the valley floor, connecting every animal to every other animal, and all of them to the central point on the mountainside where the earth breathed. Except the earth wasn't breathing anymore. Where the undulating circle had been, there was now a depression, a bowl, perhaps 30 feet across and 10 feet deep, with smooth, dark walls that glistened with moisture. The filaments converged on this bowl from every direction, running down its sides and disappearing into a dark mass at the bottom. The mass was moving. I raised my binoculars. The bottom of the bowl contained something dense and dark and wet, something that shifted and reorganized as I watched, its surface rippling with slow, purposeful motion. It looked like a cross between soil and tissue, biological but earthen, alive but mineral. It was the exposed surface of the organism, the thing that lived under the mountain, the thing that heated the ground and called the caribou, and communicated in harmonic pulses. It had opened the earth above itself. It was no longer beneath the surface. It was emerging. Marin's tracks descended the ridge ahead of me, switchbacking down the slope toward the valley floor. I followed them with my binoculars. They ended at the edge of the herd, where the first row of caribou stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark soil. I didn't see her. I glassed the entire valley systematically left to right, near to far, ridgeline to ridgeline. Thousands of caribou, bare ground, glowing filaments. The dark bowl with its shifting contents. No human figure anywhere. Her tracks went into the herd and didn't come out. I stood on that ridge for a long time. The wind was calm. The air was warm enough that my breath barely condensed. From the valley below, I could hear the pulsing louder than I'd ever heard it, deep and structured. The harmonic intervals clearer and more complex than before. It wasn't just a sequence of tones now. It was layered. Multiple frequencies sounding simultaneously, building something that was almost, not quite, but almost recognizable as a compositional structure. Music is the wrong word. Music implies human intent. This was something else. A language made of frequencies. A communication dense enough that it carried meaning I could sense but not decode. The caribou stood in it, immersed in it, connected to it through the filaments in the ground and the sound in the air. And they were not suffering. Their coats were thick. Their bodies were healthy. They stood in a warmth that shouldn't have existed, on ground that was alive beneath their hooves. And they were fine. Whatever this was, it was not taking from them. It was providing something. Heat, sound, connection to an intelligence so old and so large that the ground itself was its body. And Marin had walked into it. Not been taken, not been lured against her will. She had seen the data. She had read the patterns. She had made a decision. She had walked into that valley, knowing more about what was there than any other scientist alive. And she had done it because the evidence compelled her, and because she was not the kind of person who stopped at the edge of the most significant discovery of her career. I understood her choice. I hated it, but I understood it. I descended the ridge. The warmth increased with every step. By the time I reached the valley floor, I had stripped to my base layer a merino wool shirt and pants, nothing else, and I was comfortable. The air temperature at the valley floor was above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. In December, in Alaska, the soil was warm and soft beneath my boots. I had taken off my snowshoes where the snow ended and walked on bare ground that felt like a forest floor in May. The first caribou were 10 yards ahead of me. A wall of animals, shoulder to shoulder, facing east. They didn't react to my approach. I stopped and studied them. Breathing. Healthy. Standing in the filament web. Their eyes were open, but had the same distant quality I'd seen before, not vacant, but focused on something beyond my perception. I waited to feel whatever Dale Riggins had described. The attention, the sensation of being watched by something enormous. I waited for the organism to notice me the way it had noticed Marin taking the sample, for the caribou to turn, for the sound to change. Nothing happened. The pulsing continued. The filaments glowed. The caribou stood. The dark mass in the bowl shifted slowly. And I stood at the threshold of something that knew I was there. It must have known. The filaments were under my feet. I could feel their warmth through my boot soles. And it did not turn its attention to me. It did not dismiss me or acknowledge me or warn me. It was busy. That is the most accurate description I can offer. The organism was engaged in something. The convergence of thousands of caribou, the exposed surface in the bowl, the complex harmonic output, the expanded filament network. This was an event, a process, something that happened on a cycle, perhaps annually, perhaps less frequently. And it was happening now, and it required the organism's full capacity. I was irrelevant, not too small to notice, simply not relevant to whatever was being accomplished. I walked into the herd. The caribou parted for me, not dramatically, not like a biblical sea. They shifted slightly, a few inches each, creating a narrow corridor as I moved through. Their bodies were warm on either side of me. I could smell them, the familiar musk of healthy caribou, thick winter coats, the faint sweetness of ruminated lichen. Normal animal smell, normal animal warmth. They were calm. Some of them blinked as I passed. One cow turned her head slightly and looked at me with a dark eye that held no fear and no recognition. Just a mild, temporary awareness that something had moved nearby. Then she looked east again. I moved through the herd for what felt like a long time. The animals extended deeper into the valley than I'd estimated from the ridge. The density was remarkable. Thousands of animals packed into a space that would normally hold a fraction of that number, standing peacefully in a warmth that shouldn't have existed, connected to something beneath their feet that defied every biological category I knew. I found Marin about 200 yards from the bowl. She was sitting on the ground, cross-legged, her pack beside her, her satellite phone in her hand, though it wasn't powered on. She was facing east, toward the bowl, and she was crying, not sobbing, not in distress. Tears were running down her face in steady streams, and her expression was one of absolute openness. She looked like someone listening to something so beautiful that the body's only possible response was to weep. I knelt beside her. "Maren." She turned her head slowly, her eyes focused on me, and I saw recognition return in stages: first awareness, then identification, then context. She was coming back from somewhere. "Ashcroft?" Her voice was hoarse. "How long have I been here?" "At least 14 hours, maybe more." She looked around, orienting herself. The tears continued, though she didn't seem aware of them. "I walked in last night, around 8. It was dark. The filaments were glowing bright enough to see by. The caribou were already here. I came to observe." She paused. "I couldn't leave." "Are you hurt?" "No." She wiped her face and seemed surprised by the moisture. "I'm not hurt. I've been sitting here listening to the sound." She shook her head slowly. "It's not just sound. When you're this close, when you're inside the network, it's Ashcroft. I can feel what it is." Her voice broke slightly, not from fear, from the inadequacy of language. "It's not communicating with the caribou. It's sustaining them. The heat, the nutrients in the soil, the filament connections. It feeds them through the ground. It's been doing this forever. Every winter, when the food is gone and the cold would kill the weak ones, it calls them in, and it keeps them alive." She looked toward the bowl, where the dark mass continued its slow reorganization. "It's not emerging. It's opening itself up so the heat can reach more of them. The column I saw on the camera, 300 animals, they're coming from further and further away. The organism is extending its reach, growing the network, calling in herds that have never come here before." She paused. "It's expanding because the winters are getting worse. More animals need help, so it's growing to meet them." I sat beside her on the warm ground and looked at the bowl and the herd and the faintly glowing web that connected everything. The sound pulsed around us. Within it, I could feel what she was describing, not intellectually, but physiologically. A sense of vast, slow, patient effort. An intelligence so different from anything I understood as intelligence that calling it that felt almost insulting. It wasn't thinking the way I thought. It wasn't making decisions. It was functioning, operating, maintaining a system that it had maintained for longer than humans had been in this hemisphere. The caribou were part of that system. The soil was part of it. The heat, the sound, the filaments, all components of a single process that existed for one purpose: keeping things alive through the winter. I sat with Maren for almost an hour. The light was fading. We needed to leave. The return trip was 25 miles, and the warmth ended at the mouth of the valley beyond that. It was -28 and full darkness and real winter waiting for us. "We need to go," I said. Maren nodded. She stood slowly, steadying herself on my arm. She was stiff from sitting for so many hours, but she was uninjured. Whatever the organism had done to hold her attention, it hadn't harmed her. She was clear-headed. Her pupils were equal and reactive. Her speech was normal. She was a scientist who had spent 14 hours inside a phenomenon that exceeded her comprehension. And she was intact. We walked west through the herd. The caribou parted for us as they had before, small shifts, a few inches each, a corridor opening and closing. The sound continued behind us, but it seemed to diminish as we moved west, not in volume but in complexity. The layered harmonics simplified. The intervals widened. By the time we reached the edge of the herd, it was back to the simple pulsing I'd first heard from Maren's camp. 2, pause, 3, pause, 1. We crossed the warm, bare ground. We hit snow. The cold returned in stages, each one a small shock after the impossible warmth of the valley. I helped Marin into her outer layers. She'd left her shell and insulated jacket at the herd's edge when she'd walked in the night before. And they were cold, but dry. We put on snowshoes. We started the long walk back. Marin talked as we walked. Steady, organized, professional. She told me what she'd felt inside the network. She described a sensation of being known, not watched, not scrutinized, but known. The organism had been aware of her the way a forest is aware of rain. She was something moving through it. It registered her. It did not care about her specifically, but it had recognized that she was not caribou, and it had she struggled for the word, accommodated her, allowed her to sit, allowed her to listen, allowed her to stay without incorporating her into the system. It could have, she said. I felt the edges of it. The filaments were growing toward me all night. If I'd stayed another few hours, they would have reached me. And I think if they'd made contact, I would have felt what the caribou feel. The full connection, the warmth coming up from below. The sound not as something heard, but as something understood. Why didn't you stay? She was quiet for a long time. Our snowshoes crunched in the frozen surface. The darkness was complete around us, our headlamps cutting pale circles in the snow. Because I'm not caribou, she said. And whatever that connection is, it's not designed for what I am. The caribou go in every winter and come out every spring, and they're fine. They're adapted for it. Thousands of years of coevolution. I'm not. I don't know what that connection would do to a human brain. I don't know if I'd come back. We reached the snow machine at 1:15 in the morning. Marin rode behind me, arms around my waist, and I drove west through the frozen darkness at moderate speed, following the GPS track I'd laid on the way out. We reached her camp at 2 a.m. I checked her vitals, everything normal. She was exhausted, but cogent. I made her eat a full meal and drink a liter of water. I watched her fall asleep. I sat outside her tent in the cold and looked east. The sound was there, faint, at the threshold of hearing. 2, pause, 3, pause, 1. It pulsed through the frozen air and through the ground beneath me, and I understood, sitting there at 2:30 in the morning on Christmas Day, that I was listening to something that had been pulsing for thousands of years. Something that woke every winter and called the caribou in and kept them alive and asked nothing in return except to be left alone to do its work. And I understood what Thomas had really been asking me. The rangers who came before me had encountered this and left. Not because they were weak, because the encounter broke something in their professional framework that they couldn't repair while staying. The institution couldn't hold this knowledge. The scientific establishment might be able to, eventually, if Marin got her data analyzed and published. But the institution I worked for, Fish and Wildlife, the federal system, the enforcement framework, it had no category for this. No protocol, no form to fill out, no chain of command that would receive this information and respond with anything other than institutional reflex. Thomas wasn't asking if I could handle what I'd seen. He was asking if I could live alongside it. If I could wake up every morning in Harrow, do my job, maintain the station, and carry the knowledge that 14 miles east of town, the Earth was alive in a way that the federal government would never acknowledge and that most humans would never believe. The charter came through on December 27th. Clear weather. Marin packed the sample. It had continued growing in the glass container, the filaments pressing against the walls in their concentric ring pattern, and flew to Bethel, then Fairbanks. I drove her to the airstrip on my snow machine. We didn't say much. She told me she'd call when she had results. I told her to be careful with how she presented the findings. She looked at me. You think they won't believe it? I think the data will need to speak for itself, and I think you should let it. She nodded. She got on the plane. The plane took off and disappeared into the gray sky. I went back to my cabin. The winter continued. January, February, March. The darkness receded slowly. The temperatures remained brutal. I maintained my routine patrols, enforcement, check-ins with Thomas, station reports filed through the normal chain of command. I did not file a report about the valley. I did not mention the organism. I did not recommend restricting the patrol zone. I patrolled the eastern tundra every 2 weeks. I never went past the 20-mile mark. I didn't need to. I could hear the pulsing on calm nights from Harrow if I stood outside and listened. 2, pause, 3, pause, 1. The rhythm of something old and patient, doing what it had always done. In late March, the caribou began appearing west of the valley. Small groups at first, then larger herds, spreading across the tundra in normal dispersal patterns. Healthy animals. Fat. The cows were visibly pregnant. It was going to be a strong calving season. Thomas saw me watching them from the edge of town one afternoon and walked over. They're back, he said. They look good. They always look good. He stood beside me, watching the animals move across the still white tundra. You're still here. I'm still here. He didn't smile. Thomas wasn't the kind of man who used facial expressions for emphasis. But something shifted in his bearing, a slight settling, a release of tension I hadn't known he was holding. Good, he said, and walked away. Marin called in April. The filaments were a previously undescribed species. Not fungal, not bacterial, not archaea. The molecular analysis had placed them in a kingdom of their own, the first new kingdom of life identified in over a century. The cell structure was unique. The DNA was organized in patterns that her colleagues at Fairbanks had never seen. They were publishing a preliminary paper describing the organism's cellular biology, without disclosing the location or the behavioral observations. The location would be protected until further study could be conducted. She asked if I'd go back to the valley with her in the fall. I said I would. She asked how I was doing. I told her the truth. I was doing my job. I was maintaining the station. I was sleeping and eating and filing reports and running patrols and having coffee with Thomas Alexei on Tuesday mornings. I was living 14 miles from the most significant biological discovery in modern history, and I was keeping that knowledge in a room inside myself that I opened when I stood outside on calm winter nights and listened to the earth breathe. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're the one who stayed." I served in Harrow for 3 more years. I won't tell you about all of them. Each winter brought its own observations, its own encounters with the edge of the phenomenon, and those belong to a longer telling. The organism continued its cycles. The caribou went east every October and came back every March. Marin returned twice for extended field seasons and collected data that eventually contributed to 4 published papers, none of which described the full scope of what we had witnessed. The papers described the filament network, the thermal anomaly, and the novel organism. They did not describe the sound. They did not describe the caribou's behavior inside the valley. They did not describe the breathing ground, or the bowl, or the dark mass, or the sensation of being known by something that lived inside the earth. Some things don't survive the translation into institutional language. Some things can only be carried by the people who were there. I left Harrow in September of 2012. Not because I couldn't stay, because I'd done what I went there to do. I'd maintained the station, served the community, and held the line between a phenomenon that deserved protection and an institution that would have responded to it with the only tools it had: classification, restriction, and ultimately, either exploitation or erasure. Thomas drove me to the airstrip on the day I left. We stood beside the plane for a minute. "Who's coming after you?" he asked. "A woman named Gail Peterson. 15 years in the service, Arctic experience, good officer." "Will you tell her?" I thought about it. "I'll tell her to talk to you." Thomas considered that. Fair enough. I got on the plane. As it climbed over Harrow and banked south, I looked east. The tundra stretched toward the Kilbucks, golden with early autumn, the mountains visible for the first time in months, sharp and clear against a blue sky. Somewhere beneath that ground, the organism was sleeping, resting through the warm months, waiting for the cold to return so it could wake and call the herds and do what it had done for millennia. The earth out there had a heartbeat. Thomas's grandmother knew it. The caribou knew it. Marin had the data to prove it, locked in papers that described only what the scientific framework could hold. I knew the rest. Not because I'd decoded it or defeated it or mastered it, because I'd stayed long enough to sit inside it and listen. And what I heard, what I still hear on calm nights when I stand outside and face north, isn't a mystery. It isn't horror. It isn't a thing that needs to be solved. It's the sound of something ancient taking care of what lives above it. And the only thing it ever asked of anyone was to let it work.